So we're going to begin the video of our 7th class with a patriotic image. Make you think about the 4th of July, family, sunshine, hot dogs, Fago. Well, but September and you're 10 months away. So, back to reality. I know that was totally cruel and uncalled for, but hey, what the hey. So today's class had to do with the key concepts of American government, and we're still early in the year getting that foundation down. And of all the classes I teach, I think AP Gov has the biggest foundation. It's a pretty extensive foundation. And we started off with two rudimentary questions. Who rules and to what end? Now that seems simplistic, but it really isn't. So an answer in class could be, well, this political party controls the House, this political party controls the presidency and the Senate and so forth. But some people say it's really lobbyist. Essentially, money talks, and corporations very similar. There's big corporate interests, special interest groups, maybe religious interests. Maybe a particular branch of the government is kind of violating that checks and balances that we'd hope for. Maybe a certain sociological demographic, like rich people. Now, in the end, whoever is ruling at the time will have a different outcome. And that expression I use often, it all comes out in the wash. Whoever's running the show, we're going to see the consequences of who's ever running the show. So these are more theoretical, more philosophical, but hopefully it sparks your brain starting to think about government. Now, the book tends to focus on who governs and how. It focuses on a variety of issues that relate to decision making by the government. That's all well and good. However, be cognizant that the way things ought to be and the way things are don't always match. But the beauty of our system is that if enough people get involved, you can correct a perceived wrong. Or with this idea of popular sovereignty, if enough people want an outcome, it should happen. And history has shown, I think all of us, that when we've had committed groups of people trying to make changes, those changes happen. And I think as we go through class this year, you're going to see more and more examples. So another term that's probably one you know and one you've probably never heard of before, political power and hegemony. Now, power is defined as the ability of a person to persuade others to follow. Now, that's a pretty loaded term. Now, if I'm trying to persuade you, I could, give you a really flowery speech and try to say it's good for you and that sort of thing. Or I could take an aluminum baseball bat and say, I'm going to persuade you to do this or else, your face is going to meet bat. Now, the outcome may be the same, but one's a lot nicer way to go about it than the other. So anyway, power in government is used to maintain office by parties and individuals. Sometimes power doesn't take into effect the human impact. And in class, I asked for some examples. And again, we're going back to our history course where sometimes people rise up against the power structure, which they didn't see. And I think the most obvious example are the 13 colonies going against King George of England. I think most of you came up with that. So all matters that affect human life eventually make it on the agenda. Now, the word hegemony is dominance, it's control, and it's actual power. It might not be political power. If somebody commits a coup where they overthrow the government, whoever ran that coup had no political power, but they certainly have hegemony. Okay. So political power, is a position through legitimate means, whereas hegemony is just domination by any means, you know, possible or necessary. Which brings us to authority. Okay, now authority is defined as the right to use power in people, is the right to use power in the people accepting the decisions of those in power without any legal reservations. You might have some personal reservations or some moral reservations. An example, if I'm driving 20 miles over the speed limit and I see those lights and that police officer gives me a ticket, I accept that. That is that officer's legal authority, and I have to take it. I accept it. We accept the authority of police officers, even if they exhibit too much authority. You really can't resist them there and then. In a legal format, maybe later, but not there then and there. Now, this book refers to formal authority, which is power granted to people in governmental office by, and I in class thought, what are some examples? Fairly easy to come up with. So I know a lot of these terms are common sense, but in a AP government sense, they take on a deeper meaning. Now, this word legitimacy. Now, in the United States, legitimacy is seen through the Constitution. In my opinion, the most important precedent in U.S. history is Marbury versus Madison in 1803. It established the Constitution as the legitimate law of the land, and it created judicial review where those 9 Supreme Court justices can interpret the laws that were made by the legislative branch, enforced by the executive branch, but they can review that. And it created these checks and balances to Congress's power. And it's been very successful, in my opinion. Now, U.S. history has been a battle over legitimacy. For the Civil War, for instance, the Confederacy said, President Lincoln, your rule is not legitimate. There are people right now, as I'm making this video in 2023, who felt that President Biden's election was illegitimate. They feel it was rigged and whatnot. Some people said, hey, when I was first starting off teaching, and after 9/11, President Bush, the second President Bush, had the Patriot Act, and some people said, no, this is not legitimate. You've crossed the line. Now, Alexander Hamilton, feel free to sing the song if you want, worried the Constitution was too democratic. And then we asked in class, why? And I think what he meant by that was sometimes people who are misguided or people who see things wrong might do things detrimental to the government. I think that was the general consensus in class. Now, another foundational principle, the 3 types of democracies. So we have direct, we have representative, and we have elite. Okay, so direct is super simple. You know, our room with 30 people, you know, I ask, hey, do you guys want an essay or multiple choice test? And I could do a quick vote, zip, boom, bang, no problem. Now, representative democracy, now we have 535 congressional members that speak on behalf of 370 million Americans. That's representative democracy. Now, this one here, I would argue, is not a great thing. Elite democracy, where essentially power brokers, special interests, corporations steer democracy to their will, but not the will of the overall people. Okay, so we looked at that in class. Now, social contract theory is this idea that individuals agree to form a government. And according to the social contract theory, governments are established by people who combine to have some goal. And we're going to look at some individuals and some biographies in a second. And they have different takes on it. Now, an easy example is you and I. I go to work every day, do my best, I get a paycheck. You go to work every day or school every day and do your best in the hopes of getting into a good university and eventually making money. Now, in a sense, we both agree to each other's rules and the rules of Clarenceville for mutual betterment. You get a high school diploma, I have a job, and that's the social contract. Okay. Now, John Locke, he essentially said that people are pretty decent, are fundamentally decent. And he said, life, liberty, pursuit of property, that might sound familiar to you, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And he believed that we as human beings were born with certain God-given rights and that the government exists for us. Okay, the government is for the people. Obviously, you can see this guy being maybe the most influential person on our founding fathers. Now, juxtapose that with Thomas Hobbes, that said that life was brutish and short. And he said that, you know, the government is there, but really they are in control. Okay, it's the government that's going to do essentially what it has to do to rule. It's a much darker view than the Locke view. And then we have Rousseau. And he had this idea that man joins a society and abides by its laws, but if people fail to do the right things, they can remove their leader. Okay, now you can see the 1750 and 1776, that's precisely what we were doing. And Baron de Montesquieu, he came up with 3 really important concepts about checks and balances and separation of power and the 3 branches of government. Now, if I lumped all these people together, they were Enlightenment philosophers. Okay, if you look at American government, you can make a very strong argument that the root of it was the Enlightenment philosophical movement. And all of this inspires little James Madison. He was a little fellow, brilliant guy, who wrote our Constitution. Thomas Jefferson wrote our Declaration. Madison, the Constitution. I've heard many adults get that wrong. And it also inspires Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, which really was the Bible of the American Revolution. He talked about how we need to get rid of unjust authority and do our own thing. So these Enlightenment philosophers influenced our Declaration. It influenced our Constitution. It influenced our Revolution. Okay, that's really at the core of what we do. And bureaucracy, this is the last term from class. And Max Weber, okay, German, he had this idea that bureaucracy could be pretty good because it provides equality, structure, it's rational, it's predictable, this sort of thing. But a bureaucracy, oftentimes you hear called red tape, and it's an organization, whether public or private, made by several policy-making departments or units, and people who work there are bureaucrats. So, for example, the upside, if you had something here at Clarenceville with your lunch account, could you know exactly who to go to? You wouldn't go to your math teacher, you'd go to the lunch people. If you had a problem in terms of sports, you'd go to the athletic director, that sort of thing. And this is from class to give you a real life example. And you're going to see what's good and bad. So, our present school, we have a school board that are elected by the community members, and the superintendent, the boss, answers to them. And underneath the boss, we have other bosses. We have an assistant superintendent, the guy who's in charge of finance, and the athletic director. And they do a lot of different things underneath that umbrella, from the busing and the lunches and all that sort of thing. And beneath this layer, we have our principals and we have our vice principals. We have our teachers and our department heads, but ultimately students. So if you as a student wanted to get something done, could it be quite messy to get it done? Let's say you wanted to start a tennis team. Where would you go? Would you go to me, the teacher? Would you go straight to the athletic director? Would you go to a school board meeting? Would you have an email to the superintendent? Now, in a sense, that can get muddy. However, once you kind of crack that code of the proper channels and who are the decision makers, you can take it from there. Okay, so those were the foundational terms. There's an assignment on Google Classroom if you missed class. If you can answer those questions, I'd appreciate it. And then we have 2 more days of Chapter 1 and moving on to the Constitution after that. So thank you for watching.